Entrepreneurs are the best kind of people to, work for early stage, small to medium sized businesses, because they're willing to dive in with the owner, with the founders, and get their hands dirty and help grow the business because they have that entrepreneurship mindset.
Caleb, tell us about you. I was on your podcast. You're a podcast host. You're a business owner. Tell us all about you. It's the Intrapreneurs Podcast, right?
Yeah. It's called Everyday Intrapreneurs. Comes from the fact that I interview everyday employees about entrepreneurship, which is super fun. Talked with a lot of awesome people, such as yourself.
Yeah, man. Okay, so there's a lot to kind of dive into, but I kind of wanted to start the podcast off by just going over some like podcast ideas. So if for you, Everyday Intrapreneurs, what made you want to start that podcast?
Yeah, so I actually started podcasting for a job I had like 4 years ago now, and interviewed athletes on that. And that was really cool because we interviewed like top elite age group athletes in the sport of triathlon. And it was really fun to just hear their stories because they're like parents, they have real jobs, and then they win Ironmans all over the world. And so that was like my first dive into podcasting, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And then that made me realize how easy it is to start a podcast. So then when at the beginning of this year, I had been just curious about this concept of entrepreneurship because I had always, followed entrepreneurs such as like Gary Vee or Dwayne Johnson or, some of these really awesome entrepreneurs. And I never took the jump. And I was like, can I just learn entrepreneurship skills while working for a company? Because it provides, some stability that way. And just took a dive into this concept of entrepreneurship, messaged some friends on LinkedIn and was like, hey, have you heard of this word entrepreneurship? What do you think about it? And some had, some hadn't. And I was like, hey, I think there's something here. I'm not the only one thinking about entrepreneurship as a concept. And so that's, I was like, I'll just start a podcast chatting with some really awesome people.
Well, what's funny is the first time I actually heard the term intrapreneur was on the podcast with Levi Lindsay. So and that was before I had gone onto your podcast and before like we had connected. And, Levi Lindsay goes, I'm kind of like an intrapreneur because Levi had his own business and now he's kind of got his other like nonprofit that they're working on. We Are Mind. But it was interesting because when he said that, I was like, oh yeah, that's true. Because I didn't know what the word was. And it's kind of like one of those things where you're like, man, I didn't know what the word was, but I felt it because you're like, oh yeah, that's true. Like in sales, right? Sales is very intrapreneur and entrepreneur, right? Like it's kind of these both worlds kind of thing. Cause you're learning how to like build a business. And anyway, we can talk more about this as the interview goes on, but yeah, I'd never heard about it. I never heard the word. And then when I heard the word, I was like, dude, that is crazy because a lot of people are. And like, I think I heard Tom Bilyeu say that there was a couple different kinds of people, right? There's like the visionaries and entrepreneurs. Then there's like the linchpins. And then there's the people who are just cool with working like a 9 to 5 and going home. And like, there's nothing wrong with any of them, but like you have this weird intrapreneur and like, I would assign that to like a linchpin kind of thing. And so it's just funny how like there has to be each one of those types of people. And we just get in this rut of like saying some are better than others. And it's just very strange.
Yeah. And it's really funny because when you hear the word entrepreneur, it clicks. You're like, oh yeah, like you totally know what it is, even though no one's explained it to you. You're like, yeah, that makes total sense. Entrepreneur inside of a company. And, we can't all be entrepreneurs. Like entrepreneurs still need people to work for them, to build their companies with them. And entrepreneurs are the best kind of people to, work for early stage, small to medium sized businesses because they're willing to dive in with the owner, with the founders, and get their hands dirty and help grow the business because they have that entrepreneurship mindset. They just choose to not go out on their own.
Yeah, like work in a company. And I think we talked about it when I joined your show about these weird definitions that we all hold of entrepreneur. But let's talk about this, because you brought up this. So this is your second time doing kind of like an interview podcast. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I like to write about is how to interview people. I'm like super fascinated with the science of asking questions. And so when you were interviewing high performing athletes, right? Mm-hmm. Like in the triathlon world, how did you come up with the questions that you would ask them?
It was all about figuring out who they are as a person. So we would always do research. Myself and my co-host, we would dive into, their social media. We would have a pre-call with them as well, just to get to know them. And questions we would ask there would be, what motivates you when, you got 4 hours of sleep and you need to do your 5-hour run and 2-hour bike or whatever it might be. Those are probably flipped, but we would get to know them a little bit before having them on the podcast, because then we would know what questions to ask and know in advance. So then we could send them, hey, these are the types of questions we'll probably talk about. And half the time we probably wouldn't get to all of them, because we would just pull from what they're telling us, what stories they're telling us.
And then kind of like layer and build upon those.
Yeah. And you just dive deeper, like, oh, it's a really interesting story. Here's what I took from it. Let's dive deeper into that. So a lot of it comes from just knowing the person, but then also trying to extract what types of stories you can allow the guest to tell.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point that you bring up, is like asking a question that elicits more of a story response rather than a yes or no question, or even like a technical question, like how do you do this, right? Because we like stories more. And so, but it's funny because I'm on both sides of the camp, right? You look at Larry King, you look at like some of these really great podcasters, interviewers, they do a lot of research. So like a person who does a lot of research that I really admire as an interviewer would be someone like David Letterman. Lots of research, really great questions that kind of come out of that. But also his question, because he researched, he was able to ask like really difficult questions to like, that everybody had on their mind. So I don't know if you ever watched the interview he did. Well, it's on Netflix. It's the interview he did with Jay-Z. He asked Jay-Z some like pointed questions, and Jay-Z kind of like, you saw him like move around in his chair and kind of like, anyway, it was really fun to watch though, because you're like, holy cow. Yeah, that's a great question, because that's something we've all been wondering. But then you have on the opposite side, which is people like Larry King. Joe Rogan kind of fits into this. Sometimes he does research, sometimes he doesn't. You know what I mean? But Larry King never did research. He would just let his people come on, and then he'd be like, whatever happens, and he was really good at like finding the groove really early on. And so it's just interesting how all the different styles, and I don't know like what works and what doesn't work. But research worked for you the best then. Did you ever have a time where you went into an interview cold?
Yeah. I definitely had one during that podcast, and during this one too. There have been ones where I just forgot, and then I was like, hey, let's just do it off the cuff. And it usually you'll have a topic of a podcast, so generally what you'll be talking about, and so it's just letting the other person talk and then actually listening and then diving in and just being like, all right, like I thought this was really cool, tell me more about it. And it can spur some interesting stories.
Yeah. I think the hard part about asking questions for me is asking the questions because there's two sides to a question, right? There's the person you're asking the question to, and then the person listening to the question, which is like, and so you're kind of like, as an interviewer, you're kind of like the middle man, in the sense that like the guest has to be really excited about the question that you're going to ask. Right. And the audience and either the audience has to feel like, oh, I didn't think about that. Good question. I'm going to listen. Or like, yes, I've been thinking about that. Great question. I want to listen. Right. Because I've had both, where it's like a really interesting question for the person, but not an interesting question for the guest, vice versa. And then I've had ones where like I've just bombed questions, but whatever.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah, whatever. It's all good. But anyway, how do you navigate through those situations? Like, I guess, Yeah, I mean, I asked this, but it's just an interesting question, an interesting thought process of like, how do you figure out the right questions to ask?
I think it comes down to who the podcast is for, because some podcasts I've listened to where like their goal is actually a very selfish goal. Like I know someone who they bring on their ideal clients onto their podcasts and they want to just get to know them. So then, you know, they won't say yes to a meeting with them, but they'll say yes to a podcast. And so right. it just happens to be a good podcast that people listen to.
Right. Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
so like, you know, because they're getting good stories, or that one's marketing focused. So you have an audience of marketers that are just learning from really good marketers. I think that figuring out the right questions to ask takes a lot of practice too. Like I'm on, I think I just recorded episode 32 of my podcast, and I would say I'm not the best at asking good questions. You know, you're well over episode 200. You may have learned from trial and error of like different questions to ask. And okay, that question probably wasn't the best one to ask at that point, you know?
Well, and like, it's not what question you ask. It's like, it's really how you ask the question, because I remember early on in my episodes, because not everybody knows the people that I interview, right? Mm-hmm. So there has to be some kind of introduction there. And I just remember kind of early on, like that was the first question, and it was really bland. It was super bland oatmeal question, dude. Like, all right, tell us about you. Right. And it was like, dude, no one's going to listen to that, even though they need to, you know what I'm saying? Because it was kind of like at the beginning of this, people would rather hear like a short intro from the host and then a deeper, like, who are you question from the guest. And that one was a tough one though. What about you, man? 32 episodes is still a lot of episodes. What good questions are there? Questions that you ask every single time?
Yeah, I usually kick off every episode with just a bit of their career history, to set up like what they actually do, because I'm not specific to one business or to one industry type or anything like that. I've had, you know, HR professionals to salespeople to marketers. So like just getting their career path is interesting. And I like asking that one too, because a lot of my guests are unknown. Most of my guests, it's actually their first time being on a podcast, because they're just kind of your everyday employee. And so they're not used to the limelight. And so that question just gets some knowledge out there. And then I always ask at the end of the podcast, entrepreneurs that inspire them. Because like we all follow some type of entrepreneur, whether we want to admit it or not. And intrapreneurs, I feel, have a reason for following those entrepreneurs, because they are trying to learn skills from them. They're trying to find inspiration as an entrepreneur. So, it
makes a lot of sense. I like that. I think having a good set of like go-to questions, because man, have you experienced this? Because I used to experience it quite a bit. People who just like, because a really good question can go so far, but if somebody like doesn't want to answer it, it's still a tough question, you know. And I've had people who've never been on a podcast before, and those are, I mean, it can be really, really good, or it can be really, really tough. And so like that's where good questions come in, which is like, how do I take somebody who's not comfortable in front of a mic? And I had this experience too, when like I would put people in front of, like, we would sit down in front of, like, you know, because my live setup, we got cameras in your face. There's 3 cameras. There's the mics right in your face. Like, you know, it's very close quarters, right? And man, I just see some people freeze up. But then having that like conversation and those questions kind of loosens people up. Have you ever had to just like, have you ever gotten to a point in an interview where you just had to like dig? You're like, oh shoot, this isn't going well.
I had one, or I did have to ask like kind of the same question like 3 different times. I just had to you can't tell that it's the same question, but if you take a moment to think like, what is he actually asking here? It is the same question. It's just reframed a few different ways. Yeah.
To get to get an answer. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
To dig.
Yeah. He you know, it would be like a 1-sentence answer. And it was like, all right, like, let's get more. Like, this is kind of what I'm talking about here. Let's get some more.
Yeah.
But I like to make my podcast very conversational, so it doesn't feel like an interview. And so it just feels like you're hopping on a call, getting to know someone that's geared towards this topic of entrepreneurship. And I feel like that helps, where it's more conversational in nature, not so much interviewees. And having a pre-call beforehand lets them know how your communication style is as well. So you have
I think
that pre-call beforehand, and it makes it a lot more relaxed. Like, hey, like this is just how I talk, and this is how it is, and this is how it will be. And they either accept to go on the podcast or not because they don't like you. I haven't had that happen yet, but it could happen.
Yeah, I've had the opposite happen where somebody looks good on paper, and then you do a pre-call interview, and you're like, ooh, I know about that, dog.
Yeah,
I know about this. Yeah, I had one guy tell me that he was like really early on in my podcast that he could like cure cancer or something like that, and I was like, nah, I'm not trying to get canceled. Nope. I'm not trying to get canceled before I get big, man. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I was like, how about we wait on this one? And then anyway, it was a hard conversation because I try not to leave people in the dark. But anyway, what do you look for in a guest when they're coming on your show?
Ooh. I'm super active on LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. So usually that's a place where I start. I just go look at them on LinkedIn. Are they active there? Because then I can get a feel for how they are as a person in like a business sense. I have had quite a few of my guests have been referrals as well. I've done a few polls of like, hey, do you know an entrepreneur? I'd love to have them on my podcast. And then people have recommended others in their organization were like, yeah, this person totally makes a difference. I see them as an entrepreneur inside of this organization. And then, I have them on the show. That's probably been those have been the biggest two ways of getting guests, or the referrals, because it is very specific, as well as just doing a little bit of research on them. Like if they're posting about their own topics and their own thoughts, that's usually a pretty good indicator of them being slightly innovative at their company and presenting their own thoughts. Or I'll look at like their career history and just be like, okay, have they been at the same company for 10 years and had the same position? They may be clock in, clock out, do the work, which is totally fine. Or have they had different companies, different positions, or have they grown rapidly? Or I'll also look at, do they have side hustles listed on their LinkedIn? And I've had a few guests where, like, I had one guest who posted, my side hustles make me a better employee at my job. And I was like, hey, entrepreneur, let's chat. And it was a great episode.
How did that conversation go? I'm curious about that conversation, man. Like the whole side hustle along with your main hustle and like making your side hustle known. We talked about that.
Yeah.
When I came on the show.
Yeah. So like it was great. Finding a culture that supports side hustles is the best way to feed an entrepreneur soul. Like that's the best way to do it, because as long as you have clear guidelines of, hey, as long as it doesn't conflict, like you're not stealing clients from us, like, have at it. And the best way to learn a new skill is by doing it. And if you aren't able to do that in your main job, then having a side hustle where you can make a little bit of money, doesn't have to be a ton. It doesn't have to take over your main job, although some do. That allows you to build those skills, and then you can come back to your primary job and be like, hey, here's what I learned. Here's the tests I ran. Can I experiment with these projects? And if you have a good manager, most of the time the answer will be yes.
Yeah, I like that. It's always just this I feel like it's just sometimes a cat and mouse game where it's like, if I tell you, so did we talk about books on the podcast we did? I can't remember.
I think we touched on books.
A little bit?
Yeah.
Well, okay. So I get a lot of heat for reading this book, but it's one of my favorites, so I don't really care. But have you read the 48 Laws of Power?
I have not,
Robert Greene?
But you mentioned it on the podcast.
Okay, yeah, because it's tough, dude. So Robert Greene writes this book, 48 Laws of Power, and in the beginning, he's like, "Look, I'm not saying that any of these are like admirable or commendable, but he's just saying." So he says in the book at the beginning that he's like, "This is just how the world works. I'm just telling you how it works, so that you can judge for yourself in certain situations." And so one of those first laws of power is never outshine your master, which is like to say you never, like, you don't want to be the center of attention when you're not almost when you're not supposed to be, right? And somebody's going to listen to my podcast. That's why I chose to get further on to my podcast, because somebody can be like, Dalton's a crazy, not listen to my podcast. I don't care. But you know what I'm saying? And so like, I always struggled with like the balance of like telling somebody you have a side hustle and then making sure, because you know what's crazy too, though? Check this out. It happened to me. Like, that law is real. And I know it's real because it happened to me a few times. And so the answer is, right, that wasn't the right culture. I dodged a bullet, and that's all true. But it's also the inverse of that's also true in the sense that, like, you know, I would tell people like, yeah, I coach salespeople in the retail space. And then we would get in this ego pissing contest, and then I didn't get the job. You know what I mean? Because they didn't want to feel like that. Or like the question that I had to start rephrasing was the question like in an interview, which was like, where do you see what are your career goals? Mm-hmm. What are your career plans? Because I used to say like, hey, I want to manage people. Like one day I want to be where you are, Caleb. I want to be a manager. And then the next day I'd get an email that was like, hey, you're awesome, but we're not going to choose you as a candidate. And that happened to me 3 or 4 times. And again, I dodged a bullet, blah, 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 blah. But it's also, you want to give yourself the highest chances of winning.
Right.
So I had to change up the question, man. It was the answer. It's just a very strange. I don't know. What are your thoughts, man?
Yeah. It is super. So I've had the experience where, not because of a side hustle, but my entrepreneurship spirit was spreading in the organization. I was learning from different organizations, and then all of a sudden people were coming to me for advice and not my manager. And my manager really hated that. And it was like, yeah, dude. there was definitely some animosity there. And it was a rough culture that was brewing just in my own team. But then once that manager left and a new one stepped in who was all about that, like he stepped in our first interview, he was like, Caleb, I'm looking forward to the moment where I'm working for you. And I was like, okay, that's a different way of thinking about it. Like a manager saying, yeah, I'm super excited because you are awesome and you're going to be my boss someday. Like when your manager says that, then that means, okay, I have the culture and the ability to test things out, to learn and to grow. And my manager is going to be in my corner for me.
Yeah. And see, that's the good thing, right? Like when you find those people, you definitely can. And it's just funky. Yeah. How it's just how you play the games, right? Because I've had managers like that too. Like, look, one day we're going to be in the same shoes or whatever, because it's also that fine line when you're a leader, right? Like when you're a leader, you know, one of the signs of a great leader is their team still winning after they leave.
Yep.
Like you actually built character in a team versus like you were the only reason you won. Because like that's also not like a good salesperson, right? Like a good salesperson on the team lifts everybody. Like a bad salesperson, like I've been with salespeople who are like, you know, Top Gun salespeople, but they brought others down to make sure they got to the top. Mm-hmm. And that's like the exact opposite. You know what I mean? Which is just like, you know, again, it's just this crazy idea that you got to just balance it. It's just this weird power balance. But anyway, I don't know. If you ever read the book, if you ever get a chance to read the book, it's there's a reason that it's banned in prisons. I'll just put it that way.
I mean, it's on my list. I have this book list of books I want to read at some point.
What's at the top of your list?
Well, so I don't have it prioritized, which is probably where I falter, but there are over 200 books on this list. I just see books, they get recommended. I'm like, oh, that seems interesting. I throw it on the list. It's just alphabetized right now. I take notes and like it's in Notion. So it's really cool how it's built up. But
I like that.
I don't have a time limit on it because I don't want to stress myself out reading books. I'm just like, yeah, these are books that have been recommended or I've seen someone talk about that looks interesting. And then I use Kindle with Libby, which Libby connects to your library and
card.
You basically check out books. And so then I just go and see like, okay, what's available on Libby and run down my list, what seems interesting. And that's how I've read over 30 books so far this year. Is I just read through them and I'm like, all right, like, let's go.
Do you have a book that really stood out to you this year? If you were going to recommend one book, if you were going to recommend one book to somebody, doesn't matter what it is, didn't matter business, because like I have a different book for business. You only get to recommend one book. What would it be?
Atomic Habits.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Good
like
book.
Atomic Habits. That was the first one. I read that book as part of like this virtual book club I joined because I wanted to get to know some people. And that's kind of what kicked off like, hey, I haven't read in years. I learned a lot from this book. Maybe I should start reading again. And that was kind of the first book I read that then got me on this path of, hey, books have some good things in them. And so I feel like that will probably be at the top of that list for a long time of just the number one book that I would recommend because it's so powerful because it's so applicable in so many situations throughout life, business, whatever it might be. And it helped reinforce my way of looking at goals as well.
I think what's funny about that, and you just said it right, goals. So before I read Atomic Habits, I was really struggling because I was the sales trainer who was like, you see it, it's all over LinkedIn. It really irritates me. This senior SDR got passed up for a promotion because the top guy said he didn't make enough phone calls, but he was at 162% of quota. And this is why phone calls shouldn't matter. Only your results matter. Okay. So my only problem with that is, okay, in that situation, you promote the guy. He's 160% of quota. Of course, give him a shot. But I also understand the flip side, right? Because I've been with ultra high performing salespeople who think they only need to make one call a day. And by the way, dude, if you can make one phone call a day and hit 162% of quota, like good for you, man. But that's not the point though. The point is like these habits, right? Because one day you're in the sales game. Shit's going to hit the fan and one phone call a day isn't going to help you.
Yep.
You know what I mean? So it's a balance for sure. But I like that book because he brought that up. It's like, it's not about goals. It's about habits.
Yeah.
And it's about the habits that make you the person who's like worthy and capable of hitting those goals.
Right. I've had managers that have this like assigned goals to me. I'm like, I can't control anything about this goal. Like there's nothing.
It's a big one. Yeah.
It's just, I won't control the outcome here. And so then I have a conversation with them. I'm like, here are the things I can control. Can we set targets against these? Because then I feel like I'm actually making an impact instead of just at the end of the year being like, yep, we hit it or we didn't. And there were no habits building up to it. And flipping the outlook on goals is so important because if you focus on things that you can control, you'll feel more in control because you're focusing on those things.
And when you have these ultra high performers who are great, by the way, and by the way, look, I've been a manager over ultra high performers. I've been an ultra high performer. And the thing with that is like, you have to have a unique conversation with them.
Yeah.
Because like, if I'm going to somebody and I'm like, and they say to me, hey, so-and-so doesn't have to do as many calls, right? The wrong answer is, yeah, because he's better than you. Or she's better than you. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't work like that. Like you cannot run a team like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I highly doubt there are some things that Tom Brady can do that other people can't do on his team. I'm sure. But I'm sure there are some things that he's still required to do no matter what. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Right? Like, and so obviously you have a unique conversation around that with your high performance. But it's just always funny because for me in sales, like one of my hot takes was like, look, stop setting goals around what you can't control, like sales, right? Yep. Start focusing on building good habits around things you can control to get you in the right space so that you can knock those down when they happen, right? And I got all sorts of heat, but it's just like, and then they tell me these kinds of stories and I'm like, yes, all right, but like, I suck at statistics, and even I know that you take out outliers when you run in a regression test. Okay. Like I got, I was a 4.0, but I graduated with a 3.5 because I could not get a B in statistics. But I know that outliers don't count. Like you cannot count those when you're running, when you're trying to lead a team.
Yeah.
Like, of course, somebody's going to be like super high and somebody's going to be super low, but like, where's the middle, and how do we keep those guys? Because it's easier to make a B player, like a C player to a B player, than a D player to a C player and a B player to an A player. Like you just focus on these guys in the middle, and you kind of, and that's how you kind of build your team, right? Anyway, it's just, that's why I like Atomic Habits. It's a great book, and it just reinforces all those points that like building good habits makes you the person you want to be over time.
Mm-hmm. That's the key, is over time. It doesn't happen tomorrow, which can be very frustrating. Right. But it's if you have a long game mindset, then the habits you're building today, you can think, what's the most impactful thing I can do today that if I repeat and build the habits of doing that, that I will be the person I want to be in 5 years.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Cause it's like, and you know, I use this one too. It's like, so the worst health advice I ever got in my life was from one of the healthiest people I've ever known. He was an ultra track runner. Okay. He was very like super in shape, very in shape. And I was like, how do you stay healthy? And I'm not kidding you. This is what he said. He said, Dalton, just remember that if the oven's hot enough, anything burns. You see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like the worst health advice ever, right? Because he like runs 40 miles a day. So of course he can eat 5 double cheeseburgers and not get fat and not have a problem because he runs 40 miles a day. But listen, for me, I don't run 40 miles a day. I can't eat 5 double cheeseburgers and expect to like not it and not have adverse effects on my health. Right. So like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Healthiest dude I've ever met. Worst health advice I've ever gotten.
That's hilarious.
It's crazy though, because it just goes back to this thing. Well, like, oh yeah, he's a winner. You let him do whatever he wants. No, because one day it's going to catch up with you, dog. Yeah. And if you can't, and if you don't have the habits, like, you know, and I don't know actually what he did, and he was actually a really cool guy. But it was just, I just remember that experience. Entrepreneurs though, that's what you got to figure out as an entrepreneur, is like how to like navigate, because you're in a unique position when you're one of the top dogs at a company, right? Like, how do you continue your career, and how do you like navigate these critical conversations and all those things? I think entrepreneurship is a very interesting field to like study or be in or whatever, right?
Yeah. It has been super interesting because number one, there's a lot of parallels with entrepreneurship, hence the word. But number two, there's a lot of nuances on things you can't control as an entrepreneur, such as the company you work at, the culture you work at. There may be people listening to my podcast and like, I can't do that in my company. And so understanding what those variables are and how to find the right company, the right culture, that's kind of like the first step. And then next is obviously growing as an entrepreneur. But if you don't have that, then it's, how can you find that? In the meantime, you're going to want to leave the company because it can be very difficult, but how can you make the most impact while you're learning? Can't remember exactly what book it was. I think it might've been Work Rules. But basically it was saying if you are in a bad situation, learn as much as you possibly can on the company's dime while you're looking for a new job, because they'll pay for your, like most companies have some sort of learning system, or you're just learning on the company dime and you are saying, hey, this will make me a better employee, when you are looking for a better environment to go employ those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every opportunity is an opportunity to learn. And most companies do have training budgets. They'll send you to something, or like buy you a Udemy class or something like that, dude.
Yeah, exactly. Like
absolutely.
Take advantage as much as you can while you are, on the hunt, building relationships outside of work that then you can leverage to go find the right culture, because it's very hard to be an entrepreneur when you aren't part of the right culture.
Yeah, that's true. What kind of, oh man, and culture is such a big buzzword. Right. But like the culture of like, I mean, and so it's just also like very like ambiguous, you know, what's a good culture fit for me might not be a good culture fit for somebody else. Mm-hmm. So you just got to find out what works. Right. And by the way, that changes. Like for me, like early on in my career, man, I was all about, you know, and I guess I'm in one right now, like hyper growth, you know, very high pressure, high stress, like got to get it done, you know. But, you know, I'm kind of seeing the more that I, you know, I don't know, advance in my career, whatever, that all of that is really fun. And you just look forward to the time when you can like sit back and like reap what you sow. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a very interesting, I think it was like a dinner, during college. It was a former Nike VP, who lives in Utah. We had it at his house and it was good chat, good presentation, all that. He took questions afterwards and I asked the question, like, how do you balance work and life? Like, you know, your VP status at Nike, that obviously took a lot of effort. And he looked at me and he's like, there's no such thing as balance. Like that doesn't exist, because depending on the point you are in your life, your balance will shift. So as long as you can control the imbalance of your life, then you'll be fine. He said, you know, early on, you're going to be imbalanced towards school and your career early on, because you are trying to make it. You are trying to, you know, plant all those seeds that you can reap later on. And then when you have a family, okay, you may be imbalanced more towards your family and you want something that's just a stable work environment that you can, you know, go to your kids' baseball games. Like that's imbalanced towards your family. And then maybe later on when the kids are out of school, you might be imbalanced back towards work for a little bit. Like he just said, as long as you are controlling that imbalance, then you can feel like you have balance.
Yeah. I heard it put one time that very similar balance didn't exist, but it was like 100% of your attention at whatever you're working at that time. Mm-hmm. So they were just like, look, it doesn't exist, but you just need to be like 100% in, like intentional at whatever you're doing at that time, so that people feel like they're getting 100% of you. Cause like the work-life balance thing, the thesis behind why that is so important is because people feel like, if I have a big project at work, but I'm stuck at the dinner table and I know the deadline's tomorrow, I'm not present at work because I know that I have to go to dinner, and I'm not present at dinner because I know I got this deadline. Right. And so it's really like, you know, and I read a book. I read business books every once in a while, but I really like philosophy books. Anyway, read Inner Engineering by Sadhguru. Ooh, okay. And he talked about how, like he talked about how mindfulness and being present was ridiculous. And he said, because the only thing that exists in life is the present. So it's kind of like this counterintuitive argument where he's like, the past doesn't exist and the future doesn't exist. He's like, they're not real. Okay, let me back up. I'm paraphrasing this very poorly because I do understand that like the past does have an effect on how we react in the present and the future and all these things. But the point of his that section of the book was like being intentional about being right where you are, and that right where you are is exactly where you're supposed to be. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Go ahead.
I read 4,000 Hours, which is I love that book because it's like the antithesis to productivity. Which I love because, you know, productivity is like, wake up at 4 a.m. and do all this stuff. And that's what it talked about as well, is like, you're never going to be able to do everything you want to do. You're never going to be able to, you know, watch all the shows you want to, or listen to all the podcasts or all the stuff. So he's like, what will be the most impactful today? And what can you control that will create an impact today? Because today is what you have right now at this point. Like,
right.
That how can you make the most impact right now with the action you're about to take? And that I really like that aspect of it, because I've been caught up in productivity stuff where I'm like, up at 4 a.m. Yeah, I'm so productive today. And I look back on the day, I'm like, I didn't do that much.
Yeah, right. You're like, I didn't. Yeah, I've been there too. And it's like this weird hustle culture thing where it's like, it's very strange on how we do it because, right. Like, who was it? Like, maybe it was Bill Gates or something like that. Who was like, or Elon Musk is like, I try to do 3 of the most important things every day and then let everything else go or whatever. Or one of my favorite stories, I don't know if it's true or not, but like Napoleon Bonaparte had the 2-week rule. So he wouldn't read his mail for 2 weeks. And the most urgent stuff would still be there after 2 weeks. And the stuff that wasn't that important got resolved. I was like, shoot, dude. I don't know if that would work today, but
I've known people who will go on vacation and they're out of office is I'm going to delete my inbox when I return. If it's important, email me again when I get back. Like they will just straight up just say, I'm not going to read your email. And if it's still a thing, then I'll follow up on it when you email me when I return.
That's super funny, dude. I like that. But this balance or whatever. I agree. Yeah. Like, what's funny is like a lot of us, like I work in sales, I work with a lot of salespeople. And so the funny thing is like salespeople will say that they work like 60 plus hours a week. Mm-hmm. And it's true that we're on the clock 60 hours a week. Mm-hmm. But like, homie, we're not working all 60 hours of that, dude. You know what I mean? I might be working at late at night. You might catch me at an 8 o'clock phone call, but from like 9 in till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I was like, prospecting or doing something light, or whatever. Right. And I'm not saying we're all lazy either. I'm just saying, it's this idea that like be intentional. Like if you had 8 hours to get, if you, what's that law? There's some kind of law that's like, the activity will take however long you allot for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if you allot 4 hours to clean the bathroom, it'll take you 4 hours to clean the bathroom. But if you got to clean the bathroom in 30 minutes, like you'll figure out how to make it work. Right. Yep. And that's it. Like, what if you only had 8 hours to get everything done you needed to get done? And that's the messy part about ADHD. What I have. Right. Like I heard someone say it's not attention deficit disorder. It's intention deficit disorder.
Ooh. That's a good way of looking at it.
It's trippy.
I can get with that.
It's trippy. Like I'm like diagnosed. And so like when I tell you that I will not do something until the day it's due or the hour that it's due, that's absolutely true. Drives my wife nuts.
Dude, I'm editing my podcast that comes out Monday morning, Sunday night at like 9 o'clock. Being like, oh crap, I gotta get this done. It's not gonna go out.
Yeah. So like I have to be like my teachers, like I'll email like going through my MBA, like they'll be like, oh, we'll extend the deadline for you. And I'm like, no, actually, will you shorten it for me?
Yeah.
Because if you tell me that it's due on Sunday night at midnight, I'm gonna turn it in Sunday night at midnight. But if you say it's due Friday at 9 a.m., it'll be done on Friday at 9 a.m.
Yep.
And then so then the question is like, then it begs the question like, well, why don't you do that for yourself? And ADHD is really trippy like that. Like I rely super heavy on external influences. Mm-hmm. Like if I write down like this is due this day, right? I'll be like, yeah, but I know I can push it.
Yep.
I know I can push it.
But I said that. And is it really due then? No. Yeah. Oh, this person told me it is. Okay. I'll do it.
Yeah. Totally ADHD. And that's me. So like, I know that my podcast is due on Tuesday at like 10 a.m. because I set that, but people expect that from me.
Yeah. You have listeners that are like, and if you don't do it, then it's, hey, where's the episode?
Yeah. It's true, man. It's very true. So it's funny, but I really appreciate this conversation. This was really fun. I know we hit on a lot of different things, but that's why I like doing the podcast, man. But tell everybody where they can listen to Everyday Intrapreneurs, where they can follow you, boss. Yeah,
it's on every podcast platform. It's most popular, Spotify, Apple. I listen to podcasts on Spotify, so it's there. But anywhere you listen to podcasts, it's just Everyday Intrapreneurs. And then I am super active on LinkedIn, so you can find me there, just Caleb Whittle. And if you have a problem spelling Whittle, it's like you whittle a piece of wood. or whittle something down, which I laugh at whenever someone uses that in a meeting. I just smile. And they're like, hey, yeah, if we can just whittle this down a little bit. Yes,
I love that, dude. I love that, brother. Well, hey, thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.